engage in the world. And we spent a lot of time talking about emotion, but we focus primarily on positive emotions. And I would like in the present lecture to focus on an emotion that is often seen as being very negative, but actually helps us make good and rational decisions. Any emotion is a judgment about something. So if you feel positive towards something, that's a judgment. A negative emotion is the same. We know that emotions, particularly negative emotions, can be powerful almost to the point of paralyzing someone. And so it's important that we understand the role these types of emotions also play in human behavior. Moreover, all animals face threats to their survival. So we're no different than any other animal in this regard. It's important to understand the brain mechanisms that would have to be selected for that would allow us to have a very quick response to threat. And so that's what we're going to talk about now. We're going to look at one of the so-called emotions and its internal subjective experience. And that emotion or internal subjective feeling that's generated is fear. And a great deal of research in neurobiology has gone towards understanding the brain mechanisms involved. I want to stress again that we may think of it as a negative emotion when we're afraid. But in fact, having this emotion, which can be largely subconscious or even unconscious, allows us to make a rational decision, whether we're conscious of it or not, a decision about action, and one that can often save our lives. So when appropriate, fear is very important and very positive, in fact. Now, we don't know how the subjective experience of fear is generated. This is something that each of us has had some kind of experience with, so we know what's meant when someone else says that they're afraid. But we have learned about how the brain is organized to process information that is a potential threat to our survival. And this is where neurobiologists have spent their time and energy. The major player that has emerged in this research is one nucleus in the limbic system, the amygdala. And the amygdala, that means almond-shaped. It's actually a complex of nuclei that is located in the very pole of the temporal lobe. And so it's a complex of nuclei that are located beneath the cortex in this temporal pole. The amygdala is very large in human beings, and it appears to have a large number of functions. And it's actually, again, a nuclear complex, so I think in future research, we're going to find that different areas play a role in different functions. But for right now, let's just look at general functions of the amygdala. Function to process sensory information in terms of its emotional significance for the organism. Wow. To coordinate the action of a variety of systems so that an appropriate response can be made. So we use emotions to make appropriate responses in the world. And it also plays a role in emotional memory. And in fact, most memories have an emotion associated with them, and we believe that the amygdala plays a role in bringing up that emotional memory. Now, while the amygdala may play a role in the processing of emotions in general, most of the research has focused on its role in fear. And this is because we have found activation of the amygdala is actually accompanied by an internal sense or feeling of fear or anxiety. So in patients that have undergone brain surgery, for example, and who are conscious during this brain surgery, if you stimulate their amygdala, they suddenly report these feelings of fear and anxiety. And so we know that this area is involved somehow in generating this. So what are the inputs and outputs of the amygdala? In all of these lectures, we always have to talk about the anatomy of the system, how these different structures are connected to each other, because that's really fundamentally what underlies the function of a particular area. So the amygdala has widespread projections to many different areas, to neocortex, to hippocampus, hypothalamus, extrapyramidal motor system, and the thalamus. Now, instead in this lecture of focusing on each one of these, like we've done in the past in some of the subsystems in the limbic system, I want to focus on just a few of them. In particular, I'd like to look at the projection from the thalamus, because this is different than what we've seen in other systems, and it's somewhat unique, and when it was discovered, it was like, wow, this is incredible. The amygdala receives a direct projection from sensory relay nuclei of the thalamus, bypassing the cortex. Now, this has real significance, and let me tell you what this means. When information comes in from the eye, we've learned that there's a nucleus deep in the thalamus, lateral geniculate, synapses there, lateral geniculate to visual cortex. Well, that's one relay nucleus for vision. You have other relay nuclei, like the medial geniculate for auditory system. So relay nuclei are just the nuclei in the thalamus that then project axons to the cortex. Well, it turns out that those relay nuclei have direct connections to this amygdala, or amygdaloid complex, which is located here, and basically doesn't have to go through the circuit that goes through the cortex. So let's talk about what the significance of that might be. Let's imagine, for example, that you want to process a potentially dangerous and life-threatening stimulus. So as an example, I'll give a saber-toothed tiger that presents itself in my visual field. This is perfect, okay? So let's imagine, let's take two different routes here. Let's go route number one. Out here in the periphery, something moves. This is going to stimulate your rod system and the retinal ganglion cells that are specifically structured to respond to movement. What that causes is for you to then turn your head and look directly at something, which now causes the stimulus to fall on your cone system for high visual acuity and form. Now, from your retinal ganglion cells then in your fovea, we have projections to our lateral geniculate. Then the lateral geniculate would present itself or project to area 17. Then area 17 would project to higher order visual areas. Then the higher order visual areas would project to higher order association areas. Then those areas would project to the prefrontal cortex that plans a movement. And then prefrontal areas would project to area 4 that would make your legs move to get out of the way. And by this time, you would already be the tiger's lunch, or in my case, an appetizer. You would be whatever you're going to be, wouldn't be any longer. And so this is a system that isn't very good. You don't need to turn and say, oh, look, large brown animal with big teeth. It doesn't have to go through this projection to determine what something is. So what we have is a system from the amygdala that goes directly to areas. So let's look at this second route. This second route would be, yes, stimulation here, but the input going to geniculate, then immediately going to the amygdala, and the amygdala going to output. You're running before you even recognized it was a saber-toothed tiger. Now, in your experience, it seemed like you recognized what it was first. But in fact, we know that this amygdala connection is part of a survival instinct pathway that allows a potentially threatening stimulus to be responded to immediately without the neocortex being involved about what something is. Notice also that you're motivated to continue running once you realize what it was. And part of that's because you have an internal subjective feeling of fear that now is associated with what's happening. And so you actually start to run before you recognize what it is, but once you're running and do recognize what it is you saw, then you have this internal state of fear. Now, obviously, these things are all going on very complexly, but actually, this is believed to be part of the mechanism that allows us to respond to potentially threatening situations and have a very rapid response. Had we not had something like this early in our evolution, we would not have survived, clearly. So this is very important. Now, with other brain systems we've examined we realize that we learn about things both from laboratory research, from general observation, but actually from laboratory research and from looking at clinical cases. So let's see how that applies here in our understanding of the amygdala. Much of the understanding of the system has actually come about from studies that look at something called learned fear in animals. So what is learned fear? Well, learned fear is a fear response that is acquired to a stimulus that is not intrinsically threatening to the animal. So, for example, rats learn to fear a grid on which they've been previously shocked. So now if you put the animal anywhere near the grid, they become frightened and move away and try to get away from it. Now, again, we can't know what kind of internal subjective state is going on in the animal, but we can infer that there is some kind of fearful response because the animal will undergo certain changes. For example, increased vigilance. The animal will show a rise in blood pressure. They defecate and urinate in response to seeing the grid. Other changes, catecholamine release, cortisol release, that we'll learn later are part of a stress response that prepare the body for fight or flight, also are increased in animals under these conditions. So we think that it's likely that they have some kind of internally generated feelings. Learned fear has been very well studied in the laboratory, and there appear to be 4 major areas that are involved in it. The amygdala, major player. Hippocampus again, prefrontal areas of the cortex, and nuclei of the reticular formation. So what I want to do now is briefly just cover these areas and what we think is going on, because these areas are involved in learned fear and also involved in the ability of the animal to unlearn learned fear. And so it's going to play a critical role in our understanding of what's going on in clinical cases in which people experience fear. So our amygdala, again, we've already talked about it, is the major player. This is where this emotional processing is taking place. We also know that if you remove the amygdala in an animal, that the animal will not become afraid of anything. They can't learn fear responses, and they lose whatever fear response they had. So we know from animal research that animals have this kind of response. We know that in them, the amygdala is also a critical player. The hippocampus is a structure involved in learning and memory. Well, learned fear involves learning, doesn't it? So the hippocampus and amygdala are going to be tightly connected in this system. The prefrontal cortex is very interesting because it turns out that the prefrontal areas, and these would be areas here, they're not well delineated exactly what areas, but areas in the prefrontal cortex need to be engaged if an animal is to unlearn a response to something that's fearful. And so as the animal unlearns a response, he's placed back near the grid multiple times, but he's not shocked again. As the animal unlearns the fear response, then this is the area that sort of lights up, or this is the area that is engaged in the unlearning of the response. If you lesion the prefrontal area in the rat, which is a little different in organization than ours, but if you lesion that area in the rat, they cannot unlearn a fear response. And so we know that it's very critical. The last area up there listed is the reticular formation. And this is a very complicated subject, but basically the reticular formation, to remind you, is that core group of nuclei that are involved in many different functions. And some of those nuclei are involved in selective attention, and they actually can shunt information or make systems more or less likely to process certain kinds of information. We believe those nuclei in the reticular formation are the ones that are shunting information directly from the thalamus to the amygdala. So the reticular formation is making a subconscious or unconscious decision about what's been seen or heard or whatever, and actually facilitating synaptic transmission in the projection to the amygdala. I mean, this is just a fabulous thing that the brain is capable of doing. Now, we also know about the amygdala and its role in learned fear from the clinic. So again, we turn to look at the clinical evidence that suggests in humans something similar to what we see in animals is actually taking place. The amygdala appears to be involved in both instinctual fear in primates and also in learned fear. So all primates, it turns out, are afraid of snakes. Now, I had to unlearn this myself, even though it's instinctual, because I live in a log cabin on a river, and a lot of snakes decide they want to come in for the winter, to live. And I don't like that, but I had to get over my fear of the snakes in order to get them out of the house. So even instinctual fears, at least for human beings, can be unlearned to some degree. But each time I see a snake in the house, I still have a response because I don't know whether the snake is poisonous or not. Now, we know that the amygdala is also involved in learned fear responses. If you look for a functional MRI again, with functional MRI or PET scanning, where we see changes in glucose utilization, we see changes in neuronal activity, you can see that in clinical states that are characterized by heightened anxiety, panic, or fear, that the amygdala is activated. So we know that this is true. So for example, post-traumatic stress disorder. Post-traumatic stress disorder is a very real disorder that involves specific brain circuits. A stress or fear response is acquired because of some kind of traumatic event that has happened to the person. So, for example, returning individuals who came back from Vietnam, this is during the time that we discovered these things about the amygdala, some of these men suffered from post-traumatic stress syndrome, and they might be walking down the street and they would smell like burning oil, like cooking oil, and they would suddenly go into a complete and total panic attack. They would almost be paralyzed from the fear that they felt. It turns out that if you take such an individual and you put them in one of these scanners and look at their brain and look at what areas of the brain are activated, if you let this burning oil smell, if that's what triggers this for them, if you trigger this panic reaction, the amygdala lights up. And there's a decreased activation of prefrontal areas. So when the individual is in this state, this traumatic sort of state, what you have is activation of the amygdala. Now, we also know that post-traumatic stress involves other areas. So, for example, the hippocampus is involved. And sadly, in individuals where PTSD is not treated or individuals are not helped, there are permanent changes that take place in the hippocampus that are very deleterious to an individual being able to learn or remember things. And we believe this is due to a long-term chronic stress that having post-traumatic stress disorder induces. Now, when individuals are treated, however, when an individual seeks help and they undergo, say, psychotherapy for post-traumatic stress, what you see as the individual recovers is activation of the prefrontal area and now a diminution in the activation of the amygdala. So while they're in the panic state, it's the amygdala that shows the activation. When they unlearn the response, then the prefrontal cortex is called into play, just like what we see in the animal model. So what kinds of therapy do you do with individuals who have such a disorder? Well, I haven't worked with anyone with post-traumatic stress, but I have seen individuals who have had traumatic events happen to them and seen how therapy can make a difference. So, for example, there was a young woman who had been raped in a parking garage. And whenever she got within about 6 blocks of a parking garage, if it was within visual distance, her heart would start to pound, she would start to sweat, and it was really changing her life. She would not park in a parking structure. She couldn't even be near one. So she underwent what's called desensitization therapy. So in this type of therapy, what we do is we work with a person first to talk with them about the event that's happened to them, to validate the significance of what has happened to their life, talk to them about how other events in their life have influenced this. And then over time, what you try to do is maybe first of all, show a person a picture of a parking garage, for example, in her case, till you can decrease any kind of emotional response to seeing a picture, which really isn't as threatening. Then what you do much later in the therapy is you go out with the person within, say, 6 blocks, and the person is panic-stricken, doesn't want to go any closer. And you keep going back, and the person has the experience of not having anything traumatic happen to them. And they have social support with them. And what happens over time is, for example, in this girl's case, you could move her closer and closer and closer to the parking structure until she was finally able to walk into the parking structure without having these changes. And what we found is that unlearning that response, which came about because of this terribly traumatic event, involves the activation of prefrontal areas that bring rational thought, that bring analytical thinking, that bring all of these things to the situation so that the person is not just at the mercy of the amygdala. Now think about this. What the amygdala is doing is saying, get away from here, survival. So it's a positive thing, but when we have traumatic things happen to us, it can work against our being able to enjoy life or to engage in life in a normal way. Another disorder which has been well studied, but is a little bit different, and you're already noticing that different disorders occur because different areas of the brain are involved, although there may be some overlap, and that tells you something about how the disorders are related to one another. But different disorders can be a variation on a theme. So that's what we have here. This disorder is called obsessive compulsive disorder. And this is just not somebody who likes to have things neat. Obsessive compulsive disorder is characterized by chronic obsessive thoughts and behaviors, and can actually interfere incredibly with a person's ability to live life. So, for example, an individual could develop a fear of germs. Now, where this came from, there's complex theories about this, but a person could develop a fear of germs. This fear could lead them to wash their hands multiple times a day. But we're not talking about 5 or 6 times a day. We're talking about washing your hands until the top layer of skin is removed. We're talking about people who cannot not do that act. And it's motivated by this fearful response that if they don't do it, something terrible will happen. Or you have an individual that must have every single thing in a drawer has to be exactly right. Or they have this panic reaction if it isn't. Because unless it's exactly as it ought to be, it generates this horrible sense of anxiety and fear in the person. So you see that there's some things that are similar and some things a little different. Well, if we look at the brain areas that are involved in obsessive compulsive disorder, we see that some of the areas overlap with PTSD and some are a little different. And that explains the difference in the behavior. The amygdala is still the critical player in this disorder and lights up when people are in a panic state because they're unable to do what they want to do. Here, the cingulate gyrus is also activated, and we haven't talked much about this. The limbic system ring of tissue, cortical tissue that lies above the corpus callosum. We're learning that it's actually made up of a large number of different areas that are activated under different conditions. And this is currently an active area of research that we don't know a lot about. Now, in obsessive compulsive disorder, and you should be able to have guessed this, one of the areas that's called into play is a motor structure, and that's the caudate nucleus. The caudate nucleus was part of the basal ganglia nuclei in the forebrain that are part of the extrapyramidal motor system. So if you remember what the extrapyramidal motor system did, it's involved in habitual behaviors that you don't even think about, that don't necessarily come to your mind, like swinging your arms when you walk. Well, a person who has obsessive compulsive disorder, say someone who washes their hands constantly, it's like this act sets into play as a response to the fear and anxiety. And so this extrapyramidal motor system is called into play, and that's one of the reasons that how it presents in the patient is different, even though many of the same areas overlap with what you saw in post-traumatic stress disorder. The prefrontal cortex, again, is believed to be involved as people are helped to deal with obsessive compulsive disorder. And there are drugs available for OCD and also psychotherapy, and they're generally done together. And as individuals recover from this disorder, if they do recover, prefrontal areas, again, are called into play so that the individual is able to unlearn what has become a learned response to stress. Now, one of the things that is critical to point out here, in both post-traumatic stress disorder and an obsessive compulsive disorder, the panic portion or the fear portion involves an activation of the amygdala and a decreased activation of prefrontal cortical areas. As the person recovers in these states, or any kind of anxiety state or fearful state that a person may develop as a result of their experience in the world, which is our limbic system, what you see is a decreased activation in the amygdala and an increased activation in the prefrontal cortex. And so in every case that we've examined this, we see these changes take place. And this is very helpful for helping us understand how to help another person. So the individual, you can't just say to someone, well, just stop doing that. Or why do you do that? Stop doing that. There's something subconscious being generated in the amygdala, some kind of fearful response. And it may not even be, for example, hand washing. It might not even be germs. You can see people, you can have a sort of reaction where a behavior takes place that's not directly related. So, for example, someone who is raped or traumatized might suddenly start washing their hands many times. So it's not directly related to germs as much, but you see that it's projecting itself into some body system that's causing a learned kind of response. The person can't bring it to conscious awareness, perhaps, but nonetheless, it's influencing their behavior. And so our way of helping these individuals is largely psychotherapy and drugs, ways that we try to decrease fear and anxiety, and there are specific drugs that can do that. And then try through psychotherapy to bring into play these prefrontal areas that are more involved in helping the person unlearn something. And so all of the things we're learning in neuroscience are helping us understand clinical syndromes. So let's summarize a little bit about the amygdala and about what we call negative emotions. In short-term threatening situations, we need to have a rapid response. And so this is a very positive system, in fact, a judgment about the world, a judgment about an event in the world that causes us to make a change in behavior. And without it, we would not have survived. Now, sadly, in our modern world, we often react to non-threatening stimuli as though they were threatening. So, for example, we're in the car and it's a bad traffic jam and we have this incredible emotional reaction. But we can't just run away and we can't just run our car over the guy in front of us. I mean, most of the time. Okay, we can't do that. So these sort of negative emotions can be used in ways that are not good. And in our modern world, obviously, the significance of this is important because people put themselves under chronic stress situations. People who are chronically stressed on the drive to work or see minor inconveniences as being like they're life-threatening. Well, we're going to learn that when you do that, see, this system was meant to act and then stop. It was meant to save you from the saber-toothed tiger and then end. So it's a survival mechanism that wasn't meant to be chronic. If it was chronic, it has effects on the brain that are very, very negative, and particularly on some of these areas we've talked about. So in another one of our lectures, we're going to talk about the consequences of chronic stress, of chronic fear, and chronically living as though your life were being threatened and drawing this system into play. Thank you.